You've been called a futurist, the Oracle of Silicon Valley. I actually think that that completely underplays your role because you've been a real instigator and a catalyst for a lot of these things. Futurist implies that you predict the future, but you've really helped create the future. We've known each other for many years, but I've actually been a fan of your work for about 25 years. I had the whole internet cataloging guide. I was looking for it last night to get you to sign it. I couldn't find it, but literally had every single website in the internet in this guide. All 200 of them. Yeah. That's how long ago that was. So that's how, at the bleeding edge, Tim has been, and really been kind of, since then, been seeing what's on the horizon and helping be a catalyst for things that are happening in technology. If you know about, heard about Web 2.0, open source, kind of the web as a platform, the maker movement, those are all things that have been come out of O'Reilly Media. So it's a real pleasure to have you to talk about your new book, WTF.
Thank you.
Yeah, and it's a real deep dive. It's really fascinating about everything from the history of tech and how he made a lot of the predictions, and then also insights about the future. And so I want to start with asking you about your favorite prediction and how you made that prediction, because I'd like to get a little bit of a better sense for everybody of that process of creating that map and understanding what the future is going to be like.
Well, first thing I would say is that I don't actually predict the future. All I've ever done is notice things about the present and then tell a story about them in a way that helped other people to see them. So when we published that first book about the internet in 1992, we noticed that the World Wide Web was really interesting, and it wasn't being covered. The author of the book hadn't covered it, and it was actually my colleague Dale Doherty who basically said, hey, there's this thing, the World Wide Web, you got to meet this guy, Tim Berners-Lee. And the editor wrote the chapter about the World Wide Web and shoehorned it into the book at the last minute because we said, this is really important. But it was just like, wow, we believe in this. And the reason we believed in it was that we had been trying to do things like the web. We were trying to figure out what would online publishing look like in a way that was open, that was interoperable, and then along came the web, and we came at it from actually looking at how to do ebooks, and then we said, wow, this is the publishing medium of the future. So in some sense, we were just recognizing what we were looking for. And so, one of the statements that I didn't make, by the way, I'm really very fond of using other people's words whenever possible. Oscar Wilde once said, quotation is a reasonable substitute for wit, but basically William Gibson, the science fiction writer, once I heard him on the radio, and he said, the future is here, it's just not evenly distributed yet. And I've tried to live by that, and I've actually kind of recirculated that quote so often that I think it might have been forgotten, but for the fact that I picked it up. But there are people living at any point in the future. And, you've seen that with, there's people who are doing biohacking, and that's eventually going to be, like one of the things right now. I mean, how many people know that there is a group of people who are trying to bring extinct species back to life via genetic engineering? That's just news from the future. One day we'll look at something like that and go, wow, yeah, how would you predict that? Well, you go, well, there were people who were working on it in 2017.
And it takes so long that you seem so prescient.
Yeah, exactly. And it's just noticing it and going, that seems interesting. So a lot of the things that I was associated with, I mentioned the World Wide Web. That was probably the first one. The second, big one was the open source movement. And that was really just noticing that there was a narrative about free software that was centered on Linux. And I thought Linux was great, but I went, wait, but all these, programs that are behind the internet are also free software. Why aren't we talking about them? And that's when I realized that the map that was being used to describe free software was a political map about a particular license. And So the internet programs didn't fit that license and that narrative. And so I said, we need a new narrative, a bigger map that describes more of the world. So a lot of what I try to do is to tell a story about the things that I'm seeing today. And there is sort of a sense of sort of a direction towards the future. Something lodges in my head. And it's often somebody says something, probably when I think back, maybe the very beginning of, for me, of the notion that data was going to be more important than software was from some point I heard some IBM executive, it was some random talk, and he said, people talk all the time about Moore's Law, but storage is getting cheaper faster than computing is getting faster. And it just sort of lodged in my head. And it's a little bit like if you have the right kind of mental attitude, you let curious things sort of, become snags in the river of your mind. You think how you see a river and there's an old tree stump and all this stuff starts to gather on it. And it's a little bit like that. So here's this idea. And it starts to accrete, and more things accrete around it, and then you go, oh, that's actually starting to talk to me, and so part of the gift of seeing the future is to notice things that seem slightly anomalous and interesting that you don't actually know how to make sense of, and being able to hold them in a kind of a light way, so that they still hang out in your head, but you don't try to force them into a story or a map prematurely. So a big part, if I'm going on too long.
Oh, no, I'm loving this, actually, but I have so many questions, but yes.
A big part of the way my brain works was sort of shaped very early in my career by exposure to general semantics, which is this sort of crazy, kind of slightly, wacky pseudoscience thing from the 1930s. This guy, Alfred Korzybski, and he was trying to develop this, this sort of model of how consciousness works. But there's a lot of truth in it. It was sort of over-scientized, and he tried to make too much of it, I think. But the fundamental notion was to understand the process of abstraction and how much goes wrong because we don't know where we are in the process of abstraction. This is a glass of water, right? But that's actually a whole lot of abstraction. If I were a baby, I don't know that's a glass of water. I think it's this thing, and I just literally have these sensations, right? And I'm trying to figure out what it is. If I'm a kid, I'm going to knock it over probably, and I'm going to put the wet thing in my mouth. And you just think about that. You're actually building up a map of the world in which you come to say, oh, I know what that is. And once you know what it is, you kind of live in this world that's shaped by the ideas that you've already, kind of put into your map. And you have to be able to see again, with that fresh eye. And so part of the training that I got, was really when I was a teenager, it was a long story, it was sort of part of this human potential stuff in the 1970s, was just trying to understand where you are in the process of abstraction.
Well, and I think a big part of that, of what you do, is to put these crazy ideas, the things that you notice into a language. And whether it's your words or someone else's coining a term, somehow
right.
it shapes thought.
Absolutely, but the thing that I'm really trying to get across here is that you can't do that prematurely. Mm-hmm. So a lot of what people do is they haven't learned to say, okay, here's something that doesn't fit my existing map. I need to just let it sit there. And eventually it will, literally, it's an experiential process. And if you do it right, these things that are anomalous sort of eventually start to talk to you. And then you get kind of an organic map that's different than the one that you would have had if you tried to force it by thinking too much about it.
Do you consider yourself a patient person?
Yeah, I don't think of myself, no, I think of myself probably as an impatient person, but I know in this regard at least, I'll often, I do practice a certain kind of intentional patience. One of my favorite authors is Lao Tzu, the Chinese philosopher, and I particularly love Witter Binner's translation. And there's this wonderful, one of the stanzas is about the qualities of the wise man. And one of the qualities that he celebrates is, roiled as a torrent. And he says, why roiled as a torrent? And the answer is because sometimes there's nothing to do but wait until the stream clears. And I think that is that experience of, there's something there. Can you sit with it long enough for it to speak to you, for all the pieces to arrive on the table, and for the pattern to emerge? So, like, when I think about what I've done over the years, a lot of times it's just sitting with things that don't quite fit until they fall into place, and I go, oh, now it makes sense.
But you have a lot of irons in the fire, and you have the ability to hold a lot of ideas. So maybe it's a lesson for entrepreneurs to learn. I know that a lot of times when I've coached entrepreneurs and they go in to pitch an idea, they think it's all about trying to convince the other person to buy their idea, when in fact it's an opportunity to get the feedback and explore and find that product market fit. So it almost feels like you are constantly in that mode.
Oh, absolutely. So the whole process, for example, of the ideas that are in this book, WTF and What's the Future and Why It's Up to Us, I mean, there's actually a set of things. Let me just kind of give a brief outline of the book. The first part of the book is called How to Think About the Future, and it's really a little bit about these ideas that I was just talking about, although put in the context of some of these historical events like open source software and Web 2.0 and how I saw those things. And the sort of the development of the metaphors that allowed me to put a bunch of ideas together into a narrative. The second part of the book is really about today's platforms and what we learn from thinking about those platforms. The third is really the ways that our world is increasingly ruled by algorithmic systems. Think about Facebook and its influence on the world, or Google, and ultimately I get to financial markets. And then the fourth part of the book is the It's Up to Us part of the book. This is what's the role of human choice and how do we shape these things that we're building. But so when we talk about the this sort of question of these sort of multiplex narratives, a lot of it is really just being able to hold a lot of stuff in your head, being comfortable with a lot of uncertainty, and basically pursuing that clarity gradually and humbly and inquiringly. Because I started the process maybe 3 or 4 years ago with something I called the Next Economy Summit, where I'm trying to understand what is it that's wrong with the economy and what does technology teach us about it? And it's a process of inquiry. And finishing the book, I'm actually now I've been talking about the book since I finished writing it in February, and I've been waiting for it to come out, bringing lots of interviews, and I'm much clearer about a bunch of the ideas, and I have a whole lot of things that I want to work on now about platform economics, for example. How do we understand, using Google and Facebook as examples of economies, can we actually learn things about the broader economy and principles about platform economics and who gets what and why? And I've got a whole set of new questions that I'm asking.
So what are those questions?
Yeah. Well, probably the biggest one, again, and all this is implied in the book, but but I think I'm getting clearer about the questions as a result of having written it. So, when you look at our broader economy, everybody's sort of questioning the rise of inequality, the increased negative problems in our economy. And to me, there's a bad map at the heart of that. And the bad map is that the economy is somehow a natural phenomenon. That technology just wants to eliminate jobs. Companies, of course, are naturally going to try to find the lowest possible costs, which means getting rid of people whenever possible, outsourcing to the lowest labor costs, all these kinds of things. And I've come to believe that, first of all, in general, that's the wrong map. But very specifically, that what technology platforms teach us is about you design a market. When you look at what, say, Uber and Lyft are doing, they are designing markets. They're trying to figure out what's the right set of incentives to get enough drivers to show up and enough passengers to show up.
And you talked about that in the book too, about how they're making certain choices.
That's right.
Where you can be advantaging the customer or the driver or,
Yeah,
all
exactly.
sorts of,
And it was actually Jonathan Hall, who's the chief economist at Uber, who handed me, or he didn't hand me this book, he pointed me to a book called Who Gets What and Why by a guy named Alvin Roth, Nobel Prize winning economist. He got his, actually I'm not sure, he got the Nobel Prize in economics. I'm not sure he's actually an economist. What he got his prize for was for the design of kidney transplant marketplaces. He basically figured out a different way.
Seriously?
A different way of matching up donors and recipients that actually has much, much higher yield, saving, many, many lives. And it really gets across this idea. Actually, this is another economist, Mariana Mazzucato, who said markets are outcomes. And this idea that we design markets, and the fact that here, Alvin Ross could redesign the matching algorithm for kidney transplants and save all these lives, that reminds us so powerfully that the design of marketplaces has an impact. And of course, then you go look, well, what did Hal Varian do at Google? Well, he applied economics to design and to help design the Google ad matching marketplace. And it worked better than the one that Overture had designed, which in turn worked better than the one that, the old broadcast model. So here's a very clear illustration of this idea that markets are outcomes. And I'm kind of going, well, if we can see that at Google, can we see it in the broader economy?
Well, here's the question that I have. So there's something happened in 1972. There was this inflection point where all of a sudden, what used to be that the growth of the economy and the growth of wages were growing in lockstep. And then something happened where there was that's when that gap started. What happened and why? I mean, some people complain about that's when automation started. Was it Milton Friedman? Was it, and it seems like, and it's almost,
again, in a complex system, you can't assign a single cause. But I think it's very meaningful that starting in the 1970s is when this idea of shareholder primacy took over in our markets. And it's actually a really interesting little piece of history. It was in 1970, Milton Friedman wrote an op-ed in the New York Times, which was called "The Social Responsibility of Business is to Increase Its Profits." And the idea was really that, when a company takes on social causes, that it actually is usurping the rights of its owners. It should just give the money back to its owners and let them decide what they wanted to spend the money on. Now that's good in theory. It turns out in practice that op-ed was part of an offensive against Ralph Nader and the idea that cars should be made safer and more fuel efficient. So you look at that and you go, actually the market was trying to tell the world something that was important, and in fact this was an intervention to keep that from happening. So it's kind of ironic. But anyway, then this guy named Michael Jensen came along and started preaching this idea of shareholder primacy, and in particular, and this really comes to this idea of markets are outcomes. Mm-hmm. The idea was we actually need to align CEO pay with the goals of shareholders. That is pay top management in stock, and they will, of course, want to increase the value of the stock. And that's really the original sin of the modern economy. That's when we switched from, what we now think of as this special kind of company that basically takes into account social values, employees, communities, all these things that companies used to think that they ought to care about. And we told companies, no, don't care about that anymore. In fact, we'll incentivize you not to care about it.
Yeah, so it's almost as though we've reprogrammed the algorithm for our market.
So that's kind of what I'm trying to do, is use this notion that you can see that Facebook, for example, has this algorithm that said, optimize for engagement. Show people more of what they like. Show them more of what they share. Show them more of what they comment on. And Facebook told themselves, this will be really good. It will build us a great advertising business. It will increase people's connection with their friends. And then we discovered that it increased hyperpartisanship, that it led to incentives for spammers. And now we're expecting Facebook to fix their algorithms and go, oh, you didn't do what you thought you were going to do. It's a wonderful quote. For those of you who are in the tech industry, you'll really, I think, get this. It's a quote from a friend of mine in the early days of Macintosh programming. Said to me something. He said, the skill of debugging is to figure out what you really told your program to do instead of what you thought you told your program to do. And that's what Facebook is doing right now. They're trying to figure out what did they really tell their program, their algorithmic systems to do instead of what they thought they told it to do. And I think that's the broader question that I want to ask about the economy. When Milton Friedman or when Michael Jensen were talking about this idea of shareholder primacy, they thought it'll make the economy more efficient. It'll solve this problem they call the agency problem, where company management might be incented to look after themselves. But they actually created a different problem. And just as we expect Facebook to debug their system and figure out what they really told it to do, we need to start figuring out what we really told our economy to do.
Although, yeah, it's probably easier to reprogram the algorithm to favor greed than it is to program it back.
Yeah, I think that's actually really true. And that's something that actually brings up a wonderful piece of business advice from Jeff Bezos. He apparently once, he talked about one-way and two-way decisions. That you want to make two-way decisions very quickly. If you can do something and you can back out of it, that's a two-way decision. But if it's a one-way decision, a really big one that's hard to back out of, you need to be much more thoughtful about it. And I think it's a really interesting, again, that's one of those useful little maps that you kind of go, oh, okay, now that I have that concept, that tool for thinking, I can always ask myself, wait, is this an easy out? Can I just reverse this decision if I'm wrong? Great, then let's do it. Let's do it quickly. Let's authorize people, in the Mark Zuckerberg line, move fast and break things. But if it's a one-way decision, that is, once you've made this, is very hard to back out, you got to be a hell of a lot more careful.
I want to take a turn to back to kind of opportunities that are being unlocked by technology now. So one of the cool things that you get to do is surround yourself with the most amazing people, and that's, I think, why you've been able to see things. You're convening Foo Camp, amazing, just amazing people who go. What are you seeing on the horizon, the short-term horizon, that you think are opportunities that people might not be aware of, that would be great opportunities for business to know about?
Well, I guess the first thing I would say is, for the broader, business world, I think the biggest and most important shift is to realize that automation is not for doing the same thing more cheaply. When you think back to the first industrial revolution or the agricultural revolution, I'm from Ireland. They used to eat potatoes and cabbage, and that was pretty much it, and they'd get occasional lamb, right? When we had the agricultural revolution and we went, from here in the U.S. from 80%, actually no, I mean it was 60% of the population working in 1900 still on the land, down to 2%. We didn't say, you still get great. We got the potatoes and cabbage thing down. You all get them much more cheaply. We're done. Think about the incredible cornucopia of food that we all get to enjoy. We basically did more with the technology, and we think about the clothing. When the first industrial revolution, we didn't say, great, you got your one suit, and then your Sunday suit, and you're good. Now everybody has dozens.
Is that a good or a bad thing?
Well, I don't know if it's maybe it's got some untoward consequences, but we're all richer in clothing than the richest people 200 years ago. And so, when I look at a modern day example of that, I see Amazon putting robots into their warehouses, and they put 45,000 robots in between 2014 and 2016. They added 250,000 people. They didn't say, oh, wow, we can get rid of all our warehouse workers and use robots. They said, wow, if we have robots plus people, we can actually get more products to people next day. We can pack more products in the warehouse, get them out faster. A lot of zip codes, we can get products to people the same day. So they upped the ante. They did more. You know, and I look at that as the tremendous opportunity of technology. You know, Uber and Lyft, they deliver more taxi service than taxi companies. They didn't just say, wow, we can actually just deliver the same level of crappy service more cheaply. You know, and yet that is so often the narrative. You know, I talked to one investor who said, wow, I've invested in a startup that will get rid of 30% of call center jobs. And I go, why would you want to do that? Call centers suck. You know, why aren't you looking at how we use AI to make them better? And I think that the company that does figure out how to use AI to make them better is actually going to be more successful. Mm-hmm. And that's why, you know, Jeff and Elon are so successful, because they're kind of going, how do we up the ante with this stuff?
So you sound like a real optimist about the technologies. And
no, I'm an optimist about the choices that we can make. Mm-hmm. Not about, it's like it's inevitable that technology will be better.
That's a really important distinction. Yeah. Now, are you, some people that don't live in Silicon Valley or are not in tech, in other places in the country may say, okay, this Tim O'Reilly guy, he's in Silicon Valley, he's, you know, has all the tech at his fingertips, he sees all his friends getting super rich on all these technologies, it's all great for him and his buddies, what's it gonna mean for everybody else? So how do you actually reconcile that? And how do we try to reconcile that?
Well, I think, you know, there's a real, I actually am ashamed of a lot of my compatriots in Silicon Valley. You know, there's a lot of people who are sitting there saying, wow, I'm going to disrupt XYZ without giving any thought to the consequences. You know, basically, and actually, I think so many of them are not even real entrepreneurs, quite honestly. I've actually come to this, you know, just one of my little sort of observations. A serial entrepreneur is a lot more like an actor or a director or a producer going around hat in hand to movie studios trying to get their movie funded. You know, and you go, yes, that's a kind of entrepreneurial activity, but it's not the same kind of entrepreneurial activity of somebody who's saying, I have this idea, I'm wedded to it, I'm going to build this thing, you know, I really care about it. It's just like building a product that you think you can sell to a you know, a studio, and it's kind of this little short-term
And it's almost like your success is measured by how much money you raise, or that the valuation of your company on
again,
paper.
Total bad math. You talk to people, well, what have you accomplished? And they go, well, I raised X, Y, Z. And I go, well, what does that matter? You know, you know how much I raised? Zero. You know, I've been just doing.
And your company makes hundreds of millions a year, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, and you know, I started the company with $500, and I made products that people want, and I sold them to them. That's what I do. I basically, you know, that's an old-fashioned business, and I think there's so many people where the product is the ability to get an investor. You know, and I look at that and I go, that's what a bunch of people on Wall Street were doing in 2006. Hey, can we get somebody to buy this sucker? Great. You know, and when I say somebody to buy, somebody in the financial markets to buy it, not real customers. And I think we need to understand that we're in this pretty bubbly period of tech, and great stuff is happening, you know, and there is a whole side of bubbles are part of the mix. But I think John Maynard Keynes said, when, you know, there's a little frothiness is okay, but when the bubbles are the bulk of the economic activity, we're in for trouble. And I think we've been in an era where so much of what we call investment isn't really investment, it's gambling.
I want to talk about something that's near and dear to my heart. A lot of people think that tech means digital, but I think that you were one of the first, and O'Reilly Media was one of the first to really see the opportunity in applying tech to the physical world and the way it's changing. Just the way, a lot of trends, whether it's the maker movement, you know, starting maker media, make media, and Maker Faire, Internet of Things, the you know, swapping out physical with digital, all that. So I'm curious, what do you see, and a lot of the folks that I work with are in manufacturing and making in LA, what do you see as the opportunities and the big shifts that are coming for manufacturing companies?
Well, you know, probably the biggest thing that's happening right now is that the physical and the digital are interpenetrating in new ways. You know, we have a kind of, we're just at the beginning of a new paradigm of really intelligent, magical objects. And, you know, so the maker movement was certainly part of that. You kind of go, wow, we're sort of weaving electronics into things. You know, I once described the maker movement as smart stuff and dumb stuff made with smart tools. And, you know, that is...
I like the maker movement better.
What?
I like the maker movement better.
No, I well, but this sort of idea that really are two parts is we're building this set of literally things that are becoming more intelligent, and we're also building smarter tools for affecting the physical world. They're the two halves of the maker movement.
Right.
And so, you know, what that means is two things. It does mean manufacturing, but it really means thinking about how are we going to restructure workflows in the real world. You know, when you imagine examples that you know, people wouldn't think of as Internet of Things plays. You know, I look at, because both of them involve the smartphone. One is the Apple Store. It's like, okay, what if we used the smartphone instead of the cash register as the organizing tool for the workflow of a retail environment? How would we do it differently? You know, and Apple basically completely rethought retail, made the most successful, you know, retail, you know, stores in the world, you know, by giving, you know, every person's smartphone superpowers, creating a new way of interacting with customers in the real world. You know, think about what Uber and Lyft did with the smartphone and summoning cars. Again, you know, this was a realization of the capabilities of ubiquitous sensors in the hands of drivers and passengers in the real world. And I go, well, let's keep thinking along those lines. And you say, well, as we make these tools more intelligent, you know, whether it's you know, handheld devices or whether it's going to be wearables, or, you know, I do think that we are going to come back to something like Google Glass, and, you know, sort of augmented reality devices, but also, you know, what we see with Alexa and the Echo and that ilk of devices, the fact that the stuff itself is going to become smarter and connected and imbued with an intelligence that lets us talk with it. And then you go, well, the opportunity is not in making the stuff. It's actually in thinking about what would you do differently once you had the stuff. You know, and so a good example, and again, this fits back with the William Gibson, The Future is Here. You look at a company like Zipline, which is working in Africa, starting in Rwanda, delivering blood and medicine by drone on demand. You know, one of the leading causes of death in Rwanda is postpartum hemorrhage in women. You know, they don't have developed hospital infrastructure, they have bad roads. If you don't have, you know, a big repository of all the different blood types, you know, people die. You know, it would take 24 hours, 30 hours to get the blood to somebody, too late. You know, they can get blood on demand anywhere in the country in 25 minutes, you know, with drones. And they go, wow, so here's this sort of combination of, you know, what was maker technology, but it's like, wait a minute. Why do we have to do it the old way where we build these big hospital facilities and all this infrastructure? They can jump right over that. And of course, this is happening in a negative way with the use of drones, you know, by, you know, Al-Qaeda or, you know, ISIS, whatever. There's, you know, it's going to be all these new capabilities of smart stuff, you know, or dumb stuff made with smart tools that will allow us to restructure the way we do business. And there's so many industries that have this tremendous inertia. And again, you know, when you think about, like, when I imagine, like, one of the jobs of the future, it's in healthcare. What do we know from big data? We know that healthcare hotspotting is actually an incredible way to save cost. If you can identify a high usage patient and intervene before they go to the emergency room, you can actually save a huge amount of money. There are people, a very small number of people, who create a very large percentage of the healthcare costs in this country. And many of them are what they, you know, like emergency room frequent flyers, people who go to the emergency room 3-4 times a week, right? And they could actually have an on-call personal healthcare worker for less than what they're costing the system today. And you go, wow, we could identify those people. You could have community health workers with the equivalent, whether it's a smartphone app or the equivalent of Google Glass, who are able to be in touch with a doctor if they need additional help. They're effectively upskilled in the same way that an Uber driver is upskilled by their devices, so they can actually handle more situations, be more capable. They're also on call, on demand. Maybe they're dispatched by algorithm. Mr. Smith hasn't taken his medicine this week, today. Go knock on his door. That's all possible, and it would be a completely different way of thinking about healthcare. And I think we'll actually get there, and I would bet that there are startups working on that today.
Well, I think just last night we're talking about Code for America and all the great things that it's been doing in government, and in some cases it's such a simple, things we take for granted in everyday life. Just being texted to remind you to finish a form, or to make the form easier to fill out in the half hour you have in the library before it times out, or simple things like that.
Yeah, it's so interesting. The work, Code for America is an organization started by my wife, Jen Palka, that basically gets people from the tech industry and to work on the problems of government. How do we make government services as good as the best private sector services? There's this great image she uses in her talk of Moore's Law. You're familiar with the way that the power of computing doubles every 18 months, and you draw the graph of Moore's Law, and it ends up looking kind of like this. And if you're actually a couple of generations behind on Moore's Law, which government tends to be because of the slow procurement cycles, it's just that they write a long spec and they take 2 or 3 years to thing goes out to bid, and then they build it, and they literally, government gets the program that's like generations of Moore's Law behind by the time it arrives. And if you draw the two graphs, you go, government's here, private sector's here. And I was like, how do we fix that? And, clearly we have to fix the procurement cycles and so on. But we can also do small interventions where we can, as I think Jen said recently, riffing off of Mark Zuckerberg, we can move fast and fix things. Get people from the tech industry to move fast and fix things. And that's a lot of what we're trying to do.
That's cool.
Yeah.
I think I want to talk a little bit about LA, because LA is a unique beast, different from, it definitely has a very vibrant tech economy and culture, but I think that as a city, we are actually mostly manufacturing. We have 4 times as many jobs in manufacturing as in film and television.
That's awesome.
Which is crazy. We are mostly small businesses. We only have one Fortune 100 company, Disney. Compare that to Silicon Valley, it's just completely different, right? So a lot of different dynamics. Lots of creatives, as opposed, and a big kind of gig economy as well. And so I wonder how these technologies are going to be impacting Los Angeles, and how LA could actually take advantage of these trends as well.
Yeah, in some sense, maybe the point that you're making is that LA is taking advantage of these trends, and that LA is a model for the economy of the future. I have to say, I do think that this, Silicon Valley focus on that success means a hyperscale platform that gets 1 billion users, and sorry, you were in the lottery and you didn't make it. It's not a very good economy, frankly. It's, right now it looks good because lots of people are, effectively you get paid to have your, ticket to the lottery, as opposed to you have to pay. Eventually somebody pays. The investors most of those investors will lose their money. And I think we really need an economy that looks a lot more like LA's. And we need to actually understand that it is actually smaller businesses and more diverse businesses and a wider range of businesses that mark a good economy. And then ask ourselves, okay, when we build these hyperscale platforms, are they enabling that? And that is, one of the really interesting questions for me, kind of going back to that idea of how do we build platforms that become supports for a rich infrastructure of smaller businesses. Again, I think if we had the economy of LA all across this country, we'd be pretty happy. And I think your point about being manufacturing is super important. Aerospace is a big part of it. And you know, you do see things like the fact that Elon Musk has, you know, kind of reignited this enthusiasm for, you know, for space and built this, you know, new.
We had this
Awesome.
tech fair, job fair that Miragor said he had hosted, and we had, I don't know, I think it must have been 60 tech companies, and by far the longest lines of people waiting and excited about the jobs were Hyperloop One and SpaceX, definitely.
Yeah, and it really does show that one of the you know, incredible roles that you know, entrepreneurs should be playing is to inspire people to believe in a better future. And that's really a key idea in the book. You know, a lot of people ask me, well, who is this we? You know, why is it up to us? What do you mean? What can we do? And the thing that I think is so important is change happens because people believe in something different. They believe that something is different is possible. And I like to refer, and I refer to it in passing in the book, but when I was trying to explain this to one interviewer who was asking me, it was like, you know, there was a time when most of the people in the Western world, at least, believed in the divine right of kings. And a whole bunch of people here in America, and then not too much later in France, and actually it turns out in Russia about the same time, although they got put down by Catherine the Great, all came along and said, no, we don't believe that anymore. We really don't want to, you know, we don't want to play that game. And when, you know, the early colonies succeeded in breaking away from England, George III, the King of England, expected that George Washington would be crowned king in America. And when Washington went back to his farm, George III said, if he has truly done that, he is the greatest man the world has ever seen. It was unthinkable. It was utterly unthinkable that there would not be a king. And we basically started trying to figure out how to make a different kind of country, right? And, you know, it's not perfect. We're still struggling with it, you know? But, you know, it began with a set of people believing that something different was possible. And I think, you know, that's what entrepreneurs do. You know, a great entrepreneur says, the way the world works today is not the end and the only way it could work. I have a better idea. And I think we need a better idea about how to build an equitable economy, an economy that works for everyone. And it starts by believing that the economy we have is not inevitable, that it's the result of a set of choices that we make, and that we can make better choices.
Really, it reminds me of John Seely Brown writing about how the kids, surfers would watch, once YouTube came out and kids were putting videos of themselves surfing online. And the same thing happens with skating. When Travis Pastrana did the first backflip on a motorcycle, like, all of a sudden everyone started doing it because they believed that it actually could happen.
Well, or a famous one with Roger Bannister in the 4-Minute Mile. You know, as soon as you believe that something is possible. And I think that we have to tell ourselves, if we want to build a better world, we have to start believing that it's possible. And we have to get rid of the narrative that says, no, this is as good as it gets.
I want to ask one more question before we throw it out to the audience. You have this quote that I just love, and I don't feel like it's caught on as much as a lot of the other things that you've promoted, is the idea of creating more than you capture. Do you feel like it's taken off as much as it has? I mean, I think, how do we get people to, or maybe that's just not the right paradigm for people to get it?
Well, first off, I will say that, I mean, I think it is something that, whether or not that particular phrasing or that idea has taken off, it's the truth that is, systems that work have that characteristic. You know, if you're growing a garden and you take out more than you put back into the soil, you don't get as much the next year around. And, you know, I observe this in computer platforms. If you basically, as the platform owner, take too much out, eventually people go somewhere else. It's what happened to Microsoft. I think it's happening to Google today. And, you know, I think that companies have to learn that lesson. So whether or not the phrase has caught on, I mean, it's certainly been a useful principle for us at O'Reilly. We really use it as a touchstone in our thinking. But you know, it is the truth. You know, I mean, our economy right now falters because companies are, you know, they turn extractive. And there's some really good books on this. I mean, Luigi Zingales and James Robinson, I think it's James, wrote a book called, you know, Why Nations Fail. And it's basically about inclusive versus extractive economies. And extractive economies end up being less stable and less long-lasting. And I think, you know, we just have to get that that is, in fact, that, you know, a reasonably close approximation to a useful and powerful truth.
Love it. So let's take some questions.
So it's that time where questions at Live Talks LA. Just a quick reminder, they typically start with a W or an H, sometimes a D. They are generally short. There is no such thing as a two-part question, and only Z gets to ask the follow-up questions.
Thank you very much for great conversation. You've talked around regulation and taxation. You know, the market is a public good. So, you know, should the market be designed in the labs of Facebook, or should it be a public process?
You know, I guess I would say, first off, you mentioned the word taxation. I think that our system of taxation is one of the fundamental design tools of our economy that we sort of take for granted as sort of, well, it's just the way it works, you know. But in fact, you know, we have a lower tax rate on capital gains, even though capital is abundant, and we no longer need to be optimizing for capital creation. There's a lot of people who have a lot of it, and they're not actually deploying it very well, and we're creating a lot of tax policies that let them accumulate more of it and not deploy it. You know, meanwhile, ordinary people don't have enough money to spend. You know, economists, in economist speak, it's the, you know, growth is slower because of, quote, lack of aggregate demand. What that means is people don't have the money to spend. And you go, well, why wouldn't our tax policy go, well, let's actually reduce the taxes on ordinary people and raise it on people who have a lot of capital. And of course, because there's a self-serving narrative that says, well, those who have the capital should get more of it, and we're going to pay you, Congress, if you will give us what we want. So tax policy absolutely needs to change. I think that I think I've lost the thread of the rest of your question.
Regulation?
Oh, regulation. You know, the thing that I would say about regulation, and I have a chapter on that in the book, there's a lot of lessons from technology about how to do regulation right. Because, of course, our big tech platforms are regulatory systems. You know, all of our email goes through a regulatory system that decides that some things are spam and some things aren't. You know, our credit card system is a regulatory system, a very clever one, in fact. You know, government made this really smart regulatory intervention that said, hey, credit card companies, the consumer is not liable for fraud. It's your problem. You know, and you go, wow, all of a sudden they have to actually actively work to regulate fraud. You know, putting the shoe on the right foot is often the, you know, probably the most important thing that government should do, rather than kind of going, well, we're going to try to chase down all the malefactors. But the other thing, the thing that you know, you learn the most from regulatory systems like, say, Google search quality, is that it's a constant battle. And yet, government tends to say, well, here's a set of big pile of rules. We did that. We'll have another rule making 10 years from now. And we'll, in the meantime, we won't really bother measuring whether the rules worked or not. You know, versus that constant A/B testing that you see in tech companies. And a really interesting question is, could government programs be continually testing to see, hey, did we achieve the objective that we thought we were trying to achieve?
I have one more question around policy. The idea of universal basic income has really caught hold, I think mostly a lot in Silicon Valley too, which is surprising given the libertarian leanings. What do you think about it?
You know, I'm mixed about the idea. First off, it brings to mind this wonderful line from T.S. Eliot's Murder in the Cathedral, where he said, this last temptation is the greatest treason, to do the right deed for the wrong reason. You know, the idea of UBI has caught on largely because there's this idea that the robots are going to take all the jobs and there won't be any jobs for ordinary people. And I go, well, that's just wrong. We don't have jobs, look around, there's a lot of work to be done, and we're just not doing it. And we're not asking ourselves, what's wrong with our economy that we're not putting people to work doing the things that need doing? If the economy was working correctly, we would be building cities for refugees. We wouldn't be kind of having them in squalid camps. If the economy was working correctly, we would be rebuilding, tumble-down districts. We would be figuring out how to put people to work,
There are plenty of problems to solve.
There's plenty of work to be done.
Yeah.
So that being said, I do believe that, we basically aren't taking the fruits of productivity and giving it enough to people. And so, yes, should we take the fruits of this incredible machine productivity, which has created so much wealth, and distribute it better? Absolutely. Does that, but would it be basic income might be the best mechanism for that, and it's all in the math. It might be a negative income tax, but it also could be something like, well, let's just reduce working hours. Let's give people an allowance for ongoing continuing education so they can get new skills.
And that is another issue, is the rapid change, the pace of change that's happening,
that's
and
right.
it making it really hard.
All of these are policy ideas, and I go, we have to do some experimentation to see which would work best. And the idea that, well, this is a popular idea, so therefore we should do it, doesn't, to me, meet the test. I would go, well, would we rather, give everybody, reduce working hours so that we put more people to work? That's what we've done in the past very successfully. We took kids out of the workforce and sent them to school, and that raised wages for everybody else. And that was a pretty good strategy. We've done that 2 or 3 times.
Should we have not put women in the workforce?
What?
Should we have not put women in the workforce?
What would have been really good is if we'd put more women in the workforce and taken more men out, and so that they did the family work, which is real work also.
Yes. And we don't actually
and of
measure
course,
that.
it's just work that we don't pay for, and that would be an amazing thing if we went, oh, actually, and actually one of the things I'd love to see. Much more like we value things differently in our society. There's so much real important work that we just say, yeah, we don't pay for that. And of course it doesn't get done. And I go, if we're gonna have an economic system, let's get it to include all the work, not just, stuff that used to be men's work. It's a very, broken system,
In recent Next Economy newsletter, referred to the long-term stock exchange. Can you tell us a little bit about that and why it's better than the system we have now?
Yeah, so Eric Ries, who is the author of a book called, The Lean Startup.
Who I interviewed on the stage 2 weeks ago, actually.
Oh, great. And then more recently, his new book, The Startup Way, has started this thing called the long-term stock exchange, short LTSE for short. And the idea really is really a hack on the financial system, trying to create a kind of stock market in which the longer you hold shares, the more voting power you have. And the idea is that this would make it very difficult for the kind of short-term trading that a lot of companies do, where they basically buy a block of stock and then they try to influence the price of the stock and so on. So it's a new idea. It's a very ambitious idea. It's going to be very difficult to pull off, but if the time when it was ever needed, now is the time. I should disclose I'm an investor because I think it's an idea that would be an awesome way or certainly an awesome experiment in how to affect the financialization of our economy.
We have time for 2 more questions.
You've talked about these technologies that are behemoths of Google, Amazon, Uber. Could you speak of any companies that you think are on the breakthrough of disruptive technology that have unrealized potential?
Well, I think probably if we look out 10, 15 years, I don't think that any of the companies that we think of today will be the darlings of industry. I think it's likely, the two areas that seem to me are very, very likely to be big in the future. One is biotech, and the other is sort of climate remediation, climate change related, and that could be anything from infrastructure. I mean, literally, oh my gosh, we have to move a whole lot of people. How are we going to do that? Rethinking cities, rethinking coastlines. There's going to we're really headed for some incredible disruption. But I don't think any of us are good at predicting the future, because I think there's such widely divergent possibilities. I mean, we could be tumbling into barbarism. We could be on our way down in the way that the Roman Empire was on its way down. We could be heading into an incredible golden age if we get it right. We have to hold both of those possibilities, and we have to go, which of those do we like, and which one are these decisions tilting us towards? Now, right now, there's a whole bunch of stuff happening in our politics that I think are tilting us very much to the first of those two possibilities.
Which entrepreneurs and innovators do you admire the most for their potential to take us in the right direction?
Well, I admire different people for different reasons. One of the entrepreneurs I admire most is a guy named Todd Park. He was a co-founder of Athena Health and then Castlight Health, and then he became the Chief Technology Officer of the United States, originally of HHS. He's now got he's working on some new ideas that I think are going to be very interesting. But basically, I think of him because he's somebody who is working tirelessly to make the world a better place. Joseph Campbell, the great mythologist, once said that the core of Western mythology, was the story of the Knights of the Round Table, and they went off into the deepest, darkest part of the forest looking for on some quest, some dragon to slay, someone to rescue, and that like Todd is there. Give me a hard problem that I'm going to work on for a long time, and I love that. I think Elon Musk has a lot of that in him. Like, how do here's this thing, space travel or, energy transformation I really believe in. And he puts his own money at work. I mean, this is a guy who believes in what he's going after. I'm also a big admirer of Jeff Bezos. I mean, incredibly foresighted, basically has built this incredible engine single-mindedly. I mean, I think I struggle a little bit with some of the ruthless aspects of Amazon.
Making life very hard for many other entrepreneurs.
But I do think that, if I look at somebody who's playing the long game, you have to admire Jeff. And he's certainly, one of the greatest entrepreneurs of the internet. And has done amazing things.
Our final question for the evening.
Hi. So kind of going off your idea of, or your thoughts on platform economics and where value gets captured and income inequality, one of the interesting ideas I've heard recently is that blockchain might provide the mechanism to do that differently. And I was wondering if you thought about that and what your ideas are.
I have mixed feelings about blockchain. On the one hand, I think it's this incredibly interesting idea. There's two things that give me pause. One of them is simply the practical thing that we're seeing of just the immense amount of energy that it's taking, to implement blockchain schemes. We may get around that. But the thing that concerns me a little bit more is that we haven't yet seen the breakthrough applications. And when I look at something like the World Wide Web that just kind of exploded, it was like people knew what to do with it. And while there's starting to be a bunch of interesting things with blockchain, I'm not just seeing, it reminds me a little bit more like hypertext before the World Wide Web. rather than like the World Wide Web, as an example. The thing that was so amazing about the web was that Tim Berners-Lee actually failed to do hypertext right according to the theory, but he did something right in practice that made it somehow just go bang. And I'm still waiting for that for blockchain. And for me with the web, it was, part of it was the open source implementation, but it was also the 404, the idea that hypertext links didn't have to be two-way, and bingo, it just took off because of that one small design decision. And I think there's going to be something like that for blockchain. The idea is so good, just like hypertext was so good, but there's something missing. There's a piece that hasn't been, put on the table that will, stick in, and then we'll see the pattern, and we'll go, oh, now we know what this was for.
Very cool. So what would be the one call to action that you're leaving with everybody here?
Well, I say it a lot, work on stuff that matters. And I don't mean just work on do-gooder stuff. I just look around and find things that make the world better than you found it. And that can be a little thing or a big thing. But that is our obligation, all of us, every day and in our lives, to leave the world better than we found it.
How can people find you online?
Well, I'm at Tim O'Reilly on Twitter. I have a webpage for the book at WTFeconomy.com. My company is O'Reilly.com. We're an online learning company, books, conferences, and sort of online learning platform called Safari. I have a Next Economy newsletter. Again, if you just Google for that, you'll find it. I think that's probably
Awesome.
a pretty good list. I'm also on LinkedIn and Facebook and wherever.
Everywhere.
Yeah.
And if you guys are interested in entrepreneurs who make stuff, listen to the Art of Manufacturing podcast. I'll throw a little.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, I have to say that the making stuff is amazing, and everybody is a maker. And understanding what you make is super important, and to understand that it isn't just making electronics or making 3D printed designs. It's really just realizing that the world is something that we make. That
Food,
we don't
fashion,
just
so
buy.
many. Yeah. Cool.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for bringing your wisdom to us and the great stories and the vision. A lot to think about. Thanks so much.
Oh, thank you.